Hi, and welcome back to the WHVP podcast. In this episode of the podcast, Managing Partner Jamie Vrijhof-Droese sits down with the head of our legal and compliance, Daniel Koller, to discuss private placement life insurance. In this episode of the podcast, they will talk about various subjects like the changing regulatory environment in Switzerland for the financial services sector. However, the majority of this podcast will cover PPLIs and what they offer to clients when being used. Now, let's get into it.
Hello and welcome back. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce my next guest, Daniel Koller. He's a very special guest because he's not just an external expert, he's also one of our team members here at WHVP. Welcome, Daniel. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Many thanks, Jamie, for the invitation. And you wouldn't imagine it is in my entire career the first podcast I've ever done. So I'm very much excited.
I'm very honored that you choose us for your debut, and I'm sure you will do very great because you have been at a radio station recently, right, where you also spoke a little bit about your expertise. So I guess you're already very warmed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was on television too lately. So
oh, wonderful. Yes. Even better. I would say that before we get into the topic of today, which will be private placement life insurances, maybe introduce yourself a little bit and maybe also tell clients why they probably haven't spoken directly to you because you're at the moment not in a client-facing role with us, right? So you can tell them a bit more about what it is you do in the background and also how you ended up at WHVP.
Yes, sure. So as you said, I'm a team member of WHVP. And it is interesting to learn how we met each other. So let me give you a quick insight on that. So personally, from a private perspective, I was born in England. We then moved to Switzerland. I'm happily married, have two wonderful kiddies, two little ladies. And have a legal background. So I studied in Fribourg in Switzerland. I did the studies in German and in French. And once having finished my studies, I thought I would add a doctorate to my professional career. So once started in the, let's say, professional world, I actually entered into the insurance business. So I have a legal background in the insurance domain. And in 2014, I stepped out and went to a well-known broker firm that I will talk a little bit more later on. And that is actually when I met and teamed up with your father. This is now 8.5 years ago. And he asked me if I could secure, let's say, the regulatory and compliance aspect. So he has his back free for client relationship matters. So I am actually the guy in the background that makes sure that everything works from an SEC perspective, but also obviously as we are headquartered in Switzerland, also from a Swiss regulatory perspective.
That's also a very good point that you bring up now, the Swiss regulatory perspective, because as we both know, this framework is changing a lot this year. It has already started changing 1 or 2 years ago, but maybe not all our clients are aware how the regulatory situation currently is in Switzerland for asset managers. So would you mind sharing a little bit more about how that process works and what we're doing right now at WHVP? Because we are right now in the middle of a process that is a little bit time consuming and that might also be interesting for our listeners to hear about.
Yes, absolutely. So in Switzerland, we are actually in the transition period where one has to consider that maybe the US is a few years ahead and Switzerland in this perspective, a few years behind. So Switzerland decided actually to give the full license to asset managers who apply the job as an asset manager, which is actually new. So in earlier days, there was no necessity to have a particular setup in order to provide asset management. And the Swiss government decided actually to be more restrictive on that perspective. And obviously no concern about WHVP. This is a formality. We are just running through the process currently, whereas we then will get approval by the Swiss supervisory authority called FINMA, and therefore actually currently in Switzerland many asset management firms are within this process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the benefits of being or having been registered with the SEC for over 10 years now. It makes it a little bit easier to now get used to the Swiss process, because a lot of asset management colleagues who have not been registered before, they have a lot more work to do than us, because for us, we already had a lot of things in place. But nevertheless, it is time consuming, and we certainly appreciate all the efforts and work you put into that process for us. It makes it a lot easier for us people without a legal background to be able to rely on you. Now, back to the insurance broker business that we mentioned, because the compliance job that you have with us is in a smaller pensum, if you so will. You work with us a couple of days a month, but the rest of the time you are active in a different field in private placement life insurances. So maybe you can also share a little bit about what you do when you are not working with WHVP.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So I actually work for the firm 1291 Group. 1291 is the year of foundation of Switzerland. So we actually established the company in the year 2000, and then actually grew the Swissness out of Switzerland doing insurance business. What people know it from the private banking side, what we actually do is a private insurance side. I will go into more details later on. So we grew the insurance brokerage business out of Switzerland, opened it up in Europe, in Liechtenstein, to cover the European market, went on to Hong Kong, to Singapore, and now currently have established a license in Dubai. So our scope actually is to cover the global perspective of wealthy clients in order to benefit from this PPLI. So PPLI is actually private placement life insurance. And as I said, being part of the private insurance, I will at a later stage run you through the details of why should a wealthy client get into a life insurance contract, and what are the benefits and the favorable aspects of it. And actually within this setup of private placement life insurance, there is also a lot of room for asset management, having the assets within a life insurance body, and having the asset manager working on the assets and grow the underlying. And therefore, this is actually the aspect where WHVP and 1291 got together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting how those complementary services can work, and also to see how you manage to combine those two worlds together. You alluded to the benefits of this solution, and maybe you can talk a bit about that, but also how the whole setup works, what people need to consider if they are thinking about a solution like that.
Yes, absolutely. So we actually have a formula where we run explanation through this specific setup, which is called PATEC, P-A-T-E-C. And what does that mean? P stands for privacy. So we have a situation where usually clients, which might be wealthy or entrepreneurs, or also might have inherited money from the parents, for instance, they are seeking for privacy. So we are not talking about hiding money. We are not talking about offshore or illegal setup, but we are talking about discretion, we are talking about family protection, and we are talking about the structure that clients are looking for. So as soon as you bring in assets within an insurance policy, the legal ownership changes from the client's ownership to the insurance ownership. So we have then got assets within the body of the life insurance policy, and therefore one has actually a separate or a further layer of protection, not having, let's say, the name of the client shared around the globe. Then comes the next letter, meaning A, for asset protection. Very important that we here are talking about a ring fence that is structured around the assets in case of bankruptcy or in case of other, let's say, dangers of insolvency or other. We have the asset protection kicking in, meaning that the assets within the life insurance policy are protected from bankruptcy. Then we have a very, very important element, which is T for taxes. We are talking about tax optimization. So this is a very legal perspective, whereas many countries have the background to say they provide from a legal basis tax benefits for people growing their wealth within a life insurance policy, because the government likes people having their own wealth, and therefore actually from a legal perspective give a lot of benefits. So in most jurisdictions, you can actually grow your wealth tax-free, and then upon death, in most of the jurisdictions, either tax-free or with a considerable tax reduction, pass the fortune on to the next generation. This is extremely important, and that is one of the triggers why this type of insurance policies is of this much importance. So tax growth, tax deferred growth with considerable tax benefits. Then we have also the E for estate planning, which is just simply, as I already considered, one of the major triggers is structuring wealth for the next generation. So very often we have wealthy people who already are considering passing on the wealth to the next generation, whereas this estate planning is extremely efficient. And last but not least, C for cash, liquidity. So this is a structure where we can always be sure that clients have quick access to cash whenever needed. Technically spoken, it is a partial surrender, and therefore they have easy access to cash. As the same with a bank account, you would have easy access to cash and liquidity. So this is a formula of what we are actually doing in this private insurance world.
So this is all very fascinating, but I assume that the benefits are different depending on the country where the client resides and also the passports that they hold. As you know, I am sure most of our listeners are based in the US. I'm not sure if you can, like from the top of your head, also share a little bit more specific if and how those benefits also apply to Americans. Do you have a lot of American clients, not so much, and what are their main concerns when they come to you or your company?
Yes, absolutely. So very good question. I mean, the US, to be very honest, is one of the world leaders and one of the earliest jurisdictions that put in place this type of tax optimization. So we have many clients from the US who actually are looking for tax optimization and therefore get into this type of policy setup. So here, very clearly, we have specific rules that we have to comply with, that the US defines, for instance, diversification rules, whereas in the US, in order to benefit from a compliant manner, the final client should not interfere into the asset strategy, should have a diversification of the assets, meaning having investments in various ITFs, in various funds or asset structures in order to get rid of, let's say, a certain danger, having everything invested into one single element. And as you said very clearly, and you are right with that, it depends on the jurisdiction. So the US has very clear guidance. When is an insurance setup compliant? And when is it not compliant? And not compliant just simply then means that it disqualifies from a tax perspective, and we do not achieve the tax deferral over the duration of the policy. So we have to very well watch out that we do work with an insurer that has a compliant insurance product, that it is set up according to the appropriate rules in order to make the benefits for the client within the policy from a compliant manner. We also have in Europe, to make the bridge to Europe, very clear rules and guidance. When is a life insurance policy compliant according to local applicable law? And also here we have very clear guidance. And then going in more exotic countries, the more exotic, the less clear the elements are for guidance. So already in Asia, it is not that clear what has to be fulfilled in order to be compliant. And if we then maybe move to African countries or even South America, it is even less clear what is to be done in order to be compliant. Nonetheless, the good thing is we have a very stable investment within the life insurance structure, whereas typically an asset manager is appointed in order to care about the execution of the asset structure or of the asset strategy that the client defines. And here it is actually the insurance company, according to the risk appetite of the final client, who then appoints an asset manager as WHVP in order to execute the asset management within a custodian bank. And therefore, we have a beautiful combination between client's need, insurance care, and asset management execution by the asset manager.
This all sounds very good and obviously very beneficial, but it also sounds a little bit complex and like there's a variety of people and companies involved in a solution like that. So is there a minimum amount of wealth or some other parameters where you say, okay, those need to be reached for something like that to make sense?
Very frankly, it sounds complicated. It is not that complicated, but for sure, you need a professional and competent advisor in order to guide you through the necessities. Why is this the case? Let's imagine that you do not ask the correct questions. It just could jeopardize everything. So let me give you an example. We have a US client and he is intending to move to, let's say, the UK, or he follows the firm and he goes to Germany, or he wants to do pre-immigration to Australia. So if we do not have this information upfront, then the client would have an insurance product that does not match his need and his perspective. So what you need is a professional advisor who runs the client through various elements and then sets up the correct structure. And this is where our work kicks in, and that is why we are needed in order to structure this situation correctly. And coming back to your question about, let's say, minimum volumes and costs, I mean, to be very frank, it does not make sense below a certain amount, because just simply the costs would be unproportionally high related to the tax benefit or the, let's say, estate planning effects. So to give you sort of a line of guidance, I would say below 500,000 US dollar, it most probably will just simply not make sense when we run costs against benefits. And then from that amount upwards, as I said, professional advisory makes absolutely sense in order to generate those benefits around this insurance policy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all those elaborations. Another topic I would like to briefly touch upon is that unlike the rest of our team, you don't live in Zurich. I know you have very close ties to Liechtenstein, which is a small neighboring country to ours, and you're also involved there with an association. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's called Liechtenstein Insurance Brokers Association, where you are currently the president. Maybe you can also talk a little bit about Liechtenstein as a country, as a jurisdiction, but also about your involvement with that association in the country.
Yes, absolutely. Very good question, Jamie, and I'm happy to give some light on that element. So Liechtenstein is a very small country which has let's say, a certain history, which was known, let's say, for offshore structure or for undeclared money. To be very honest, this is many, many, many years ago. So things have been cleaned up, and it is a very small country with the beauty of having several agreements in place that make the country unique. So as you know, Switzerland is not part of the European Union or the European Economical Area, but is just an island within within Europe. So once we move out and Liechtenstein is just abroad of Switzerland to the east, we actually have bilateral agreements with Switzerland. We have multilateral agreements with Europe and also other agreements with the rest of the world. So we have access to other markets, whereas Switzerland does not have this possibility from an insurance broker perspective. So I'm not talking about asset management here, I'm talking about insurance brokerage, whereas you have to be licensed when, for instance, you provide advices to an Italian client or to a French legal entity or other. You need to be licensed in those countries, and that is not possible to do it out of Switzerland from a cross-border perspective. So there we sit in Liechtenstein, where we are benefiting from the cross-border and the free services that can be provided over the various borders. And as you mentioned, I actually accepted to become president of the Liechtenstein Broker Association, short called LIBA, almost a year ago, with a scope of trying to build up a sophisticated, stable market for insurance brokers in Liechtenstein. So just to give it a number, we are roughly about 50 licensed brokers in Liechtenstein, so only 50, which is nothing. And my intention, or our intention, is really to collect the competencies of the insurance broker market in order to undertake best effort and best outcome for the final clients. As you are aware of, insurance companies typically work for their own needs, and we are actually the long arm of the final clients. So we are mandated by the final clients in order to seek for the best solution individually for each client. So that makes this profession very important. And as I said, in the role as a president, I am quite near to government, the supervisory authority, and generally to the market, which is always a benefit when you hear the grass grow, rather than run after things that were maybe set up in a wrong manner.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think we've already come to the end of the time that we have allocated for today's conversation. So thank you so much for being here and sharing all your knowledge and your expertise. Is there a place where people can reach out if they want to learn more about you, get in touch, or learn more about 1291 Group?
Yeah, sure. I mean, on two sides, we don't forget that especially we are here for WHVP, and therefore you can reach out at any time to Jamie and to me. We are available 24/7, being very motivated to be here for you. And if you have an element, a question, a query on insurance matters, just reach out to 1291. You find our website in the internet, and I'm also there. Obviously, I'm a bit more in the background, but I have many, many colleagues of mine, sales partners, advisors, lawyers, tax specialists who are very keen to match up and to provide advice to you.
Sounds great. I will make sure to include the website to the 1291 Group in our show notes and below on YouTube as well. Thank you again, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Bye, Jamie.
Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the WHVP podcast. If you'd like to learn more about us at WHVP, check us out at our website, found here on the screen just below at Find Us At. If you'd like to look at any of our other social media handles, check us at Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or YouTube. Have a great rest of your day.